My neighbor leaned close and whispered, "We shouldn't be having this conversation." But my heart had already decided otherwise. The late afternoon sunlight poured gently over the quiet street, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The kind of warmth that felt personal, like it was meant for just one pair of eyes to linger on. I found myself walking past my neighbor's apartment, again, though I told myself it was purely accidental. There was a rhythm to the street at this hour. The distant hum of cars, the occasional bark of a dog, the whisper of leaves stirred by a lazy breeze. And then there was her. She was tending her small garden, bending gracefully to prune a plant that seemed almost too delicate for the world. I hadn't noticed how much the sunlight caught on the gold necklace at her throat or how her hair, dark with subtle hints of auburn, fell over her shoulders in gentle waves. She was 42, mature but effortlessly graceful, with a quiet confidence that made her presence magnetic without demanding attention. I froze, not out of fear, but because there was a certain stillness to her that made the world feel like it had paused. Our eyes met through the half-open window, and the brief contact sent a strange warmth through me. It was only a fraction of a second, but it lingered far longer than it should have. Her smile was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting neighborly glance. But when I looked away, I realized my fingers had curled slightly, as though holding on to that moment a little longer. There was a subtle intimacy in the way she moved, how she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers lingered on the petals of the flowers she was tending. I noticed everything. The curve of her shoulder as she stretched, the soft exhale when she adjusted a plant, the slight furrow of her brow as she focused. It was mesmerizing, and I couldn't pull my gaze away. Part of me hated the intensity of my own attention, but another part couldn't stop. A neighborly wave would have been normal. A simple hello would have been expected. But words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, we shared a moment in silence. Two people aware of each other's presence. The distance between us charged in a way neither of us dared define. That first spark wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a bold declaration. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. Yet the air between us felt charged with something unspoken, something forbidden yet familiar. It was a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, we were about to discover something more than ordinary neighborly curiosity. As I walked away, my steps were slower than usual. My mind replayed the brief contact over and over. The tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the way sunlight caught her in a moment that felt suspended in time. And in that quiet, golden hour, I realized that whatever this was, it had begun quietly, and it would not remain quiet for long. It was one of those evenings when the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the hallway of our apartment building bathed in a soft, amber glow. The air smelled faintly of rain from earlier showers, clean and crisp, carrying the subtle scent of wet cement and flowers from nearby balconies. I was coming back from a quick errand, my mind still occupied with mundane thoughts about work, groceries, and the monotony of routine. And then I saw her. She was struggling with a paper bag of groceries, her posture graceful yet slightly tense under the weight of the unexpected spill of oranges at the top. I stepped forward instinctively, reaching out to steady the bag. Our hands brushed, and it was sudden and electric. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the space between our fingers. Her eyes widened slightly, a blush creeping up her cheeks, and I felt my own pulse spike. "Oh, thank you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, as though the hallway itself demanded secrecy. She laughed lightly, a warm, melodic sound that made the tension in the air simultaneously heavier and lighter. We straightened, and there was a pause, neither of us ready to break the fragile moment that had formed. I noticed details I hadn't before. The faint scent of her perfume, soft and comforting. The way her hair fell in loose waves around her face. The slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the groceries. She was effortlessly composed, yet there was a vulnerability there, subtle and human, that drew me in more than I expected. We exchanged a few words about the weather, the neighborhood, small talk that felt meaningless on the surface but was weighted with an unspoken energy. Our glances lingered a second too long. A brush of shoulders as we navigated past each other down the narrow hallway left a warmth that neither of us could ignore. Every step away from her felt reluctant, like leaving a conversation that had only just begun. There was a tension in the way we both laughed at minor jokes, careful not to overstep yet unable to resist the pull. Her eyes held mine longer than they should have, and I caught a fleeting vulnerability in her expression. A hesitation, a question unspoken, perhaps asking if this connection, however brief, could exist without consequence. By the time we parted, the hallway seemed emptier than before, the air heavier with the weight of possibilities. I could still feel the echo of her touch, the warmth lingering where our hands had met. I realized then that the spark from our first distant glance hadn't merely flickered. It had grown, imperceptibly yet insistently, into something undeniable. I walked away slower than usual, savoring the memory of her smile, the soft brush of her hand, the quiet intimacy of our unplanned interaction. That moment wasn't dramatic, it wasn't earth-shattering, but it was ours. A brief collision of worlds that left both of us aware, perhaps for the first time, of the subtle and forbidden attraction building between us. And I knew, without fully understanding how, that nothing about our connection would remain casual for long. Night had settled over the neighborhood, soft and velvety, with the faint glimmer of city lights in the distance. From my apartment window, I could see her balcony, a small, private oasis illuminated by a single warm lamp. She was there, seated in the wicker chair, a cup of tea warming her hands, the steam curling lazily into the cool night air. For some reason, I felt compelled to be outside, drawn to that quiet corner of her world, to the soft aura she carried even alone. I stepped onto my balcony, careful to make no sound. She looked up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met across the narrow distance between our apartments. The faintest of smiles tugged at her lips, and my chest tightened. Something about the way she held herself, relaxed but not careless, distant but not closed off, made my heart ache with curiosity and a longing I didn't fully understand. "I didn't expect anyone to be out here," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper carried by the night air. She gestured for me to sit on the railing opposite her, a small invitation that felt more intimate than words. As I settled in, careful to respect the invisible boundary between our spaces, she began to speak. At first, it was small talk about the stars, the unusual quiet of the city tonight. Then, almost imperceptibly, her tone shifted. She spoke of loneliness, of moments when life felt heavier than it should, of regrets tucked away beneath a composed exterior. I listened, my own breath shallow, captivated by the honesty she revealed without needing to raise her voice. She leaned slightly forward, hands curled around her mug. I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes shone with vulnerability. It was a side of her no one else saw, a careful, tender side that felt dangerous to witness, yet irresistibly magnetic. I felt the urge to reach out, to offer some comfort, but I hesitated, aware of the unspoken rules that governed our connection. Our eyes met again, and the silence stretched, full of meaning. I could feel her awareness of me, of my presence so close yet physically restrained. There was a pulse in the quiet, a current running through the space between us that neither of us wanted to name aloud. "I don't usually share this," she said, almost shyly, "but sometimes it feels like no one notices the small things that matter." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I caught the faintest quiver in her hands. "I notice," I said, softly, letting my words carry the weight I couldn't put into anything more overt. "I notice everything." She looked at me then, really looked, her gaze lingering longer than before. There was a spark of something unspoken, a connection, fragile yet undeniable. For a moment, the world outside the balcony ceased to exist. There was only her, the warmth of her presence, the quiet honesty between us, and the subtle electricity that made the space between us charged with possibility. That night, I realized that our connection was no longer a passing curiosity. It had begun to grow quietly, through shared silence and unspoken understanding, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would demand more than just fleeting glances across the balcony. The rain had started again that evening, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows and sliding down the glass in silver rivulets. The world outside was blurred and quiet, the kind of stillness that made every small sound, like the rustle of paper, the clink of a cup, or the shift of a chair, feel amplified. I found myself standing at her door, an invitation unspoken but understood between us, drawn by a need I didn't fully recognize. She opened the door a crack, just enough for a sliver of warmth and candlelight to escape. Her expression was calm but wary, eyes flicking toward me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books, comforting yet intimate. I stepped in, careful to keep my presence gentle, aware of the fragile tension that already hung between us. We settled near the window, watching the rain blur the city lights outside. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that encourages honesty, the kind that feels both dangerous and safe at the same time. She poured 2 cups of tea, the aroma rich and soothing, and handed one to me. Our fingers brushed as she passed it, a fleeting touch that made both of us flinch and smile at the same time. Then, almost abruptly, the conversation shifted. She leaned back slightly, eyes locking onto mine, voice low and almost breathless. "We shouldn't be having this conversation," she whispered, as if saying it louder would shatter the fragile connection forming between us. Her words carried the weight of warning, but underneath it, there was something else. Hesitation, longing, a question unasked. The silence that followed was heavy. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the subtle bite of her nails against her cup, the way her eyes searched mine for a reaction. My heart raced, caught between the thrill of being close to her and the fear of crossing a line that society, and perhaps even we ourselves, had drawn so carefully. "I know," I admitted softly, my voice barely above the rain's patter. "But sometimes the right moments aren't the easiest ones." My words hung between us, tentative, vulnerable. She shifted slightly closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, yet not so close that it became improper. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the warning in her tone seemed to conflict with the pull in her eyes, the subtle desire in her posture. Fingers brushed again, this time deliberately lingering, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden tension simmering between us. Everything about the room felt heightened. The muted light, the rhythmic sound of the rain, the closeness of our bodies across the small table, and the unspoken words that neither of us dared to voice. There was longing in the quiet, a quiet that demanded attention, respect, and patience. By the time I left her apartment, soaked slightly from the rain on the way back, I felt a mix of exhilaration and restraint. That whispered warning wasn't a rejection. It was a spark, a line drawn that tempted us to inch closer without stepping over. And in that moment, I realized how thin the boundary between propriety and desire could feel when every glance, every touch, carried the weight of unspoken emotion. The weekend morning air was crisp but welcoming, carrying the scent of fresh soil and blooming flowers from the small community garden we shared. The sun was gentle, not yet harsh, casting a warm, golden glow over the beds of vegetables and flowering plants. I had arrived early, pretending it was to check on my own small patch, though really I knew she would be there soon. She appeared a few minutes later, carrying a basket of seedlings, the corners of her eyes crinkling as she smiled at the sight of me. There was a lightness in her step that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't fully understand. She greeted me with a soft good morning, her voice warm and steady, yet underneath it, there was a playful undertone, a subtle recognition of the connection that had been building between us over weeks of quiet glances and whispered words. We worked side by side in the garden, our movements slow and deliberate, almost choreographed. I handed her a trowel, and our fingers brushed as we exchanged it. She paused, her gaze lifting to meet mine, just long enough for the air between us to thrum with unspoken acknowledgement. It was a fleeting contact, yet it carried more weight than any words could. As we planted seeds together, she leaned slightly closer, guiding my hand to make a deeper hole in the soil. I felt the warmth of her fingers against mine, a light pressure that was tender but intimate. She chuckled softly at my fumbling attempt to plant a stubborn seed, and I laughed too, a little embarrassed, a little thrilled. Our shared laughter created a bubble of familiarity and trust, a tiny world where nothing else existed but the simple act of being together. At one point, she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught a faint whiff of her perfume, lavender, soft and comforting. The closeness, the gentle warmth, the ease of our interaction made my pulse quicken. I realized I was acutely aware of every subtle movement. The way her shoulders relaxed when she laughed, the tilt of her head when she concentrated on a task, the softness of her gaze when it found mine. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just quiet, meaningful contact. Our knees brushed lightly as we knelt to plant. Our hands met in the dirt, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. It was in these small, deliberate touches that the emotional intimacy between us deepened, a silent understanding growing alongside the seedlings in the soil. By the time we finished our work, the sun had climbed higher, warming our faces and hands. We stood together, surveying the small garden, our shoulders brushing slightly. It was a simple, ordinary moment, yet it was charged with a subtle tenderness, a recognition of the closeness we had allowed ourselves to feel without crossing the boundaries we both silently acknowledged. As we parted for the day, our hands lingered for just a second longer than necessary in a gentle farewell, a silent promise that these moments of closeness were only the beginning. And I knew, deep down, that the garden had become more than a shared space. It had become a sanctuary for something delicate, something quietly growing between us. Twilight had settled over the quiet street, painting everything in shades of deep blue and soft amber. The world felt hushed, as though holding its breath, the distant hum of traffic muffled by the gentle hush of evening. I walked beside her, careful to match her pace without speaking too much. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was expectant, a taut line drawn by weeks of unspoken glances, lingering touches, and quiet curiosity. We reached a lamppost at the corner of the street, the soft light spilling over her features and highlighting the gentle warmth in her eyes. She stopped, and I instinctively slowed, unsure whether to speak, whether to shatter the delicate tension that had been building like a quiet storm. Her gaze met mine, and I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against the space between us. I began, my voice tentative, almost swallowed by the evening air. I paused, searching her face, trying to read the thoughts behind her steady, cautious expression. I can't stop thinking about you. Her breath hitched slightly, and she turned her head just enough to avoid my gaze. There was a hesitation in her posture, a subtle shiver that betrayed the conflict within her. You shouldn't, she whispered, the words fragile but firm. You know we shouldn't. And yet, she didn't step away. The distance between us felt impossibly small, yet it carried the weight of everything unsaid. My hand itched to reach for hers, but I hesitated, not wanting to cross the invisible boundary she had drawn. Instead, I let my fingers brush the sleeve of her coat, lightly, almost accidentally, and she flinched, then allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. That tiny gesture said more than words ever could. Acknowledgement, curiosity, desire restrained by caution. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, shimmering with something raw and unguarded. I don't know if this is right, she admitted, voice soft, tinged with fear and longing. I could hear the tremor, feel the vulnerability she rarely showed to anyone. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, I whispered, letting my words fill the space between us. I feel this, and I can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. For a long moment, we just stood there, the streetlights casting gentle shadows, the hum of the distant city fading into nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, our hands met. The touch was tentative at first, fingers intertwining lightly, lingering. The warmth of her hand in mine sent a shiver up my spine. Our closeness was electric yet tender, a perfect blend of restraint and yearning. Her head tilted slightly, closer than before, and I felt her breath mix with the evening air. Neither of us spoke, because no words could capture what was happening. The tension, the longing, the quiet confession of feelings that had been building for weeks. It was a delicate, powerful acknowledgement that something undeniable had formed between us. As we finally stepped apart, reluctantly, I knew this night had changed everything. The hesitation, the fear, the social boundaries, they all remained, but so did the undeniable truth. We could no longer ignore what had grown quietly, imperceptibly, between us. The connection was no longer subtle. It demanded attention, honesty, and courage. The first light of morning spilled over the neighborhood, soft and golden, chasing away the shadows of the night. I stepped onto my balcony, and there she was on hers, already awake, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The world was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds and the distant hum of early traffic. Everything felt intimate, suspended in a gentle calm, as though the universe itself had carved out this morning just for us. She looked up and smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made my chest tighten. There was no need for words yet. Our eyes alone spoke volumes. I stepped closer to the railing, careful to respect the space between us, and offered a soft, tentative greeting. "Good morning. Good morning," she replied, her voice warm, steady, and familiar. The simple exchange carried a weight of shared nights, whispered confessions, and small, tender touches that had grown into something undeniable. We sipped our tea in companionable silence, the steam curling between us like a soft veil, connecting our little worlds. My eyes wandered over the familiar lines of her face, the slight curve of her smile, the way her fingers wrapped around the cup with quiet assurance. There was a peace in watching her that I hadn't realized I'd been craving, a quiet joy in knowing that we had crossed an invisible boundary and survived it. Finally, she spoke, her tone soft, almost hesitant, yet filled with sincerity. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that's happened." She paused, glancing down at her cup. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I don't want to ignore what we feel." I nodded, my fingers brushing against the railing, imagining the warmth of her hand if it were there. "Neither do I. It's complicated, yes, but it's real. And that's enough for me right now." A gentle breeze lifted her hair, and she reached up to tuck a strand behind her ear, her eyes never leaving mine. There was a vulnerability there, balanced by the quiet confidence that had drawn me to her in the first place. I could feel the emotional distance between us shrinking, replaced by a sense of connection that felt both tender and powerful. She leaned slightly closer across the balcony, our shoulders almost touching, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence. Just the warmth of proximity, the comfort of shared presence, and the subtle, unspoken promise that we were choosing to explore this connection together. Her gaze softened, and she offered a small smile that mirrored the one I had been holding back. "We don't have to have all the answers today," she whispered. "We just start here together." I let out a quiet laugh, the relief and happiness bubbling up, and replied, "Together then." As the morning sun fully illuminated our little corner of the world, I felt an ease I hadn't known for weeks. The hesitation, the fear of judgment, the uncertainty. They still existed, but they no longer overshadowed the quiet joy of our connection. Hand in hand, across the narrow balcony space, we embraced the moment. Fragile, tender, and full of promise. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right, and I knew that whatever the future held, this bond, built on patience, honesty, and subtle, meaningful closeness, would endure. If this quiet, forbidden connection touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more slow-burn age gap romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that was impossible to ignore? Hit the bell so you won't miss our next story of love, longing, and emotional tension.